Jung Il Woo has always looked like the kind of man television was built to protect. He carries the face of a romantic lead too naturally, too effortlessly, as if the camera never had to work hard to turn him into fantasy. For years, he moved through Korean drama like a figure slightly removed from ordinary life, elegant, soft-spoken, polished, and touched by a sadness that made even his beauty feel fragile. He was the kind of actor audiences did not just watch, they projected onto him. A prince, a dream, a man designed for longing. That is what made his image so powerful. Jung Il Woo did not need loudness to become memorable. He only needed presence, and the public gave that presence a meaning almost immediately. He became the face of a certain emotional fantasy, the beautiful man who seemed built for tenderness, romance, sacrifice, and quiet pain. Even now, his aura still carries that same pull. He does not look like someone life should interrupt. He looks like someone life should spare. And that is exactly where the illusion begins. Because when an actor becomes associated too deeply with grace, melancholy, and screen-born beauty, the audience starts imagining that the life behind the face must be just as smooth as the image itself. But Jung Il Woo's real story was never about a fantasy that flowed effortlessly from one perfect chapter to the next. It was about interruption. That is what makes his image more haunting in hindsight. Behind the prince-like roles, the elegant sadness and the polished screen presence was a life that kept refusing to move in the clean, beautiful line his image promised. Health, pauses, military service, and the quiet burden of having to return again and again gave his story a shape far less effortless than the public fantasy around him. And that is the central contradiction of Jung Il Woo. He looked like a man made for escape, yet his life kept dragging him back into reality. The screen kept offering him worlds of romance, destiny, and emotional grandeur. Real life kept answering with delay, uncertainty, and endurance. So the real story of Jung Il Woo is not just how he became one of Korean drama's most enduring prince figures. It is how a man whose face seemed built for fantasy kept surviving the interruptions that fantasy could never protect him from. And maybe that is why his image still lingers now. Not because it stayed perfect, but because it never did. Before Jung Il Woo became the kind of actor audiences instinctively placed inside romance, longing, and soft tragedy, he was just a young man growing up long before the camera turned him into a feeling. That matters, because the image the public would later love always looked so complete that it almost erased the possibility that he had once been ordinary. But no one begins as a fantasy. They begin as someone still becoming themselves while the world slowly decides what parts of them it wants to keep. Jung Il Woo was born in 1987 in Seoul, and long before the polished screen presence, there was simply a young man stepping toward an industry that is quick to recognize a face before it understands a soul. That is how the first illusion begins for many actors like him. Beauty arrives first. Presence arrives first. The camera notices what it can capture before the audience notices what the person might become. For Jung Il Woo, that early recognition carried a quiet danger. He had the kind of face that could easily be turned into projection, elegance, softness, youth, fragility, a suggestion of sadness even before real sadness entered the role. And once the industry sees that in someone, it starts building around it. It starts imagining not who you are, but what kind of dream you could become for other people. That was the real beginning of Jung Il Woo's story. Not just a young man entering entertainment, but a young man being translated into an image almost before he had the chance to define himself on his own. That translation found its first major form with Unstoppable High Kick, 2006, the sitcom that brought him broad attention and placed his face directly into public memory. It was not yet the full Prince image that would define him later, but it was the door that opened everything else. From that point on, Jung Il Woo was no longer simply entering the industry, he was being absorbed into it. The public had seen him, remembered him, and begun attaching feeling to him. That is always a dangerous stage in the making of a star, because once audiences connect an actor to a certain emotional response, the image starts growing faster than the person beneath it. With Jung Il Woo, the image that began to form was one of softness, youth, visual grace, and a certain emotional accessibility that made him easy to cast into fantasy later on. But even here, at the beginning, the seed of the later burden was already being planted. The camera liked how easily he could be turned into longing. The audience liked how naturally he could be remembered as a mood rather than just a performer. And those are the kinds of gifts that open doors while quietly narrowing the shape of the future. Long before health interruptions, military service, or the weight of repeated comebacks, Jung Il Woo had already stepped into the first version of the role life would keep asking him to carry. Not simply an actor, but a beautiful emotional image the public would always want to preserve. Jung Il Woo's rise worked because the industry eventually found the exact kind of roles his face had always been threatening to become. From the beginning, he had carried an image that did not belong naturally to realism. Even when he was just entering the public eye, there was already something about him that felt slightly removed from ordinary life, too polished, too soft, too emotionally suggestive to remain only a familiar young actor. But recognition is not the same thing as myth, and for a while Jung Il Woo still lived in that space between being remembered and being fully claimed by the public imagination. He had the face people noticed, the aura people responded to, and the kind of screen presence that could make emotion feel larger than dialogue. What he needed next was the right kind of story. One that would stop using his appearance as a bonus and start building the emotional architecture of a character around it. That is when his rise truly began. With 49 Days, 2011, and the role of the scheduler, Jung Il Woo stepped into a character that felt almost designed to confirm what audiences had already half believed about him, that he could make beauty feel melancholic, distance feel intimate, and mystery feel emotionally alive. The role mattered because it was not simply romantic in the obvious sense. It was haunted, restrained, strange, and sorrowful, which meant it turned his visual softness into something more memorable than attractiveness. It turned it into atmosphere. From there, the public no longer just remembered Jung Il Woo as a handsome actor who had arrived at the right time. They began remembering him as someone whose face could carry longing itself. That shift is crucial, because once an actor becomes associated with longing rather than just beauty, the audience starts placing them inside a different category of memory. They do not just look good on screen, they start feeling like they belong to the emotional fantasy of television itself. And that is exactly what Jung Il Woo was becoming. That image only deepened with Moon Embracing the Sun, 2012, where he played Prince Yang Myung, and later with Cinderella with 4 Nights, 2016, as Kang Ji-woon. These roles did not merely keep him visible, they completed the fantasy. By this point, Jung Il Woo no longer felt like an actor who occasionally fit prince-like emotionally heightened material. He felt like one of the faces Korean drama could use whenever it needed beauty touched by sadness, romance touched by distance, and masculinity softened by emotional vulnerability. That is a powerful kind of rise because it gives an actor more than popularity. It gives him symbolic function. Audiences begin to understand what he means before he even speaks. They see him, and the emotional temperature of the scene changes immediately. That is what happened to Jung Il Woo. He became the kind of actor whose very presence could suggest yearning, fate, regret, and tenderness before the plot had earned any of it. But that is also where the hidden cost of his rise begins to take shape. The stronger the prince image became, the easier it was for people to mistake it for ease. The more perfectly he fit fantasy, the more the public could imagine that his path through the industry must also have been graceful, beautiful, and naturally blessed. In reality, the very image that lifted him also placed him inside a narrow emotional expectation. Always elegant, always romantic, always carrying that same polished sadness. The rise made Jung Il Woo unforgettable, but it also started turning him into a type. And once an actor becomes a type powerful enough, the public begins loving not only the person, but the emotional promise they attach to his face. That is why his breakthrough matters so much in the larger arc of the story. It was the point where Jung Il Woo stopped being simply a successful actor and became a fantasy the audience wanted to keep returning to. And the danger of becoming a fantasy is that real life rarely agrees to stay that beautiful for very long. The real pressure in Jung Il Woo's story began the moment life stopped moving and the graceful line his image seemed to promise. That is what makes his arc heavier than a simple rise and return narrative. By the time the public had fully accepted him as one of Korean drama's most recognizable prince figures, the fantasy around him had already become very clear. He was the beautiful man touched by sadness, the actor who made longing look elegant, the face that seemed built for romance, fate, and emotional distance. But fantasy becomes dangerous when people start mistaking it for reality. Because the more perfectly Jung Il Woo fit that image, the easier it became to imagine that his real life must also have been unfolding with the same smoothness. In truth, the exact opposite was happening. In 2016, Jung Il Woo revealed that he had been diagnosed with a cerebral aneurysm, a condition serious enough to shadow the way his future had to be imagined. That detail matters because it shattered the illusion of ease at the center of his image. Suddenly, the man who looked as if television had designed him for dreamlike stories was being forced back into something much harsher and less cinematic, the reality of a body that could interrupt everything. And interruption is the right word for Jung Il Woo's burden. His story is not built around scandal, disgrace, or public collapse. It is built around stops, delays, the painful knowledge that no matter how perfectly your image fits the fantasy people love, real life can still break the rhythm without asking permission. That is what makes his pressure feel so different from other stars. He was not fighting to repair a damaged reputation. He was fighting to continue existing inside an industry that is brutal to anyone whose momentum is broken, even temporarily. The image of the prince remained beautiful, but beauty could not make the interruptions disappear. It could only make them feel sadder in retrospect. That burden deepened when military service entered the story. Even though his health condition was serious enough that many would have expected exemption, Jung Il Woo still began his mandatory military service in December 2016 and completed it in November 2018. That decision gave his story a weight that the fantasy image alone could never have carried. Because now, the prince figure was no longer just being interrupted by life in the abstract. He was being pulled through time, duty, uncertainty, and physical reality in a way that forced the public to confront the difference between the man and the image they had built around him. This is where the emotional center of his story becomes clearer. Jung Il Woo's pain was never loud. It did not explode. It did not become scandal. It became endurance. And endurance is a lonelier kind of burden because it rarely gives the audience a single dramatic moment to focus on. Instead, it asks them to notice absence, pauses, and the quiet cost of staying intact. That is why his repeated returns matter so much. Every comeback after those interruptions carried more than a new role. It carried proof that he was still here, still able to walk back into the frame the public had once associated so naturally with him. But returning is not the same as resuming. A man comes back changed even when the face looks the same. And that is the hidden ache inside Jung Il Woo's image. The very thing people loved most about him, the sense that he belonged to a softer, more beautiful emotional world, became more fragile once life had cut through it. After that, the prince image no longer meant ease. It meant resilience. It meant that every elegant role, every sad gaze, every romantic silhouette on screen was now shadowed by the knowledge that the man beneath it had already learned what it means to be interrupted and still continue. That is why the emotional truth of Jung Il Woo's story is not that he stayed beautiful in spite of difficulty. It is that difficulty changed what his beauty meant. What once looked like fantasy became something more human, and because of that, something much sadder and much stronger. And yet, what makes Jung Il Woo's story linger is that he did not lose the image life kept interrupting. He carried it through the interruptions and returned with it changed. That is what makes his present-day presence feel different from the fantasy the public first fell in love with. He is still recognizably the same man, still elegant, still gentle, still carrying that prince-like sadness that made him so easy to place inside romance and longing. But now that sadness lands differently. It no longer feels like a beautiful surface designed only for television. It feels earned. It feels lived in. The pauses, the health fears, the military service, and the repeated need to come back after time had already altered the emotional weight of his image. So when Jung Il Woo appears now, whether in later works like Heichi 2019, Bossum, Steal the Fate 2021, Good Job 2022, or Our Golden Days 2025 to 2026, the audience is not only looking at the old fantasy of the screen prince, they are also looking at endurance. The same face remains, but the meaning behind it has deepened. What once looked like an effortless emotional fantasy now carries the ache of someone who had to keep returning to it after life repeatedly pulled him away. That is what makes his current image feel so quietly powerful. He no longer seems like a man untouched by hardship. He seems like a man who learned how to keep beauty intact even after hardship changed what beauty meant. That is why Jung Il Woo's legacy feels more melancholy than triumphant. He is not the story of a star who won by never being interrupted. He is the story of a man whose fantasy image survived because the person behind it endured more than the image ever promised. And maybe that is the final truth of his career. The prince figure the public loved was never fully false. It was simply incomplete. People saw the elegance, the softness, the sorrow, the romance. What they did not fully see at first was the discipline required to return after fear, uncertainty, and absence. That is what gives his later work its resonance. It is not just that he still fits the frame. It is that he fits it differently now. There is more gravity in the stillness, more history in the sadness, more truth in the gentleness. And that is why his story ends with something more beautiful than untouched fantasy. It ends with durability. Jung Il Woo remains memorable not because life left him unchanged, but because change did not take away the emotional world people once loved in him. It only made that world more human. In the end, he is not unforgettable because he always looked like a prince. He is unforgettable because life kept interrupting the fantasy, and he kept finding a way to return with the light still on.